Hello everyone, this is part 11 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of 6 Parts, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
Call me a god. You call me a god. You call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Around 1,000 of your ninja years ago there was a man, likened to a traveling holy man similar to the monks of today. Naruto grinned at that, already having a feeling for who the Kyuubi was talking about. Like me, the great fox merely leveled an irritated gaze at him, clearly telling him to shut up. However, he was far more than just a monk, he could see things others couldn't, use powers others found impossible. It took him a great many years to understand his abilities. By the time he was done, a great evil had arose in the lands he lived in. It is greatly simplified, but the most you need to know is that it was a terrible beast known only as the Kyuubi. Naruto blinked at that, remembering back to the time he had been first told of the sage and that illustrated monster he was fighting. Many events occurred that are a long story for a different time, however it culminated with the sage defeating the monster, sealing its energy within himself and becoming the first Jinchuriki. Naruto was also surprised by that and couldn't help but start drawing parallels between himself and the sage. He became known as a great hero, hailed by many as a god for his unworldly abilities that even before becoming a Jinchuriki surpassed many of your so-called legendary shinobi of today. The fox snorted to himself, even Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha paled in comparison to the power held by the long-dead sage. However, even the sage had his limits like all you ninja, and eventually, despite the overwhelming power he had accumulated, he was forced to face his own mortality. He feared that the creature he had kept locked away within his body would be released upon his death, so he took precautions. When he was old and frail, merely a shadow of his former self, he released the energy within him, shaping it and molding it into 9 separate beings. At that, Naruto gained a sudden look of understanding, to which the Kyuubi only nodded once. You aren't as simple as you appear, ninja. Yes, all 9 Beiyu are simply an aspect of our progenitor, the Kyuubi, given new form and mind. As a final precaution, the sage sealed the great beast's body within an enormous construct of stone before throwing it into the sky. I believe your kind call it the moon. Naruto at this point nearly had his jaw on the ground. In a figurative sense, everything he was being told was just incredible. Wait, that actually happened. The Kyuubi just narrowed his eyes at the small blonde, daring him to interrupt again. Yes, the sage's power even on his deathbed was unrivaled. I believe he used the land that once occupied what you know as Mizu no Kuni. The fox seemed somewhat repulsed he was forcing himself to use these human terms just to tell his story. However, that is irrelevant. Shortly after giving us life, the sage sickbed to his own humanity, leaving only a legacy in the form of his 2 sons, progenitors of the Senju, and the fox grimaced as if the next words might poison his mouth. Quote, Uchiha clans. The beast took a moment, seemingly trying to rid himself of the foul taste that word left in his mouth. For a time, there was peace. Many remembered the teachings the sage had passed on in his times. Slowly the shinobi system as you know it today came into existence as people twisted ninjutsu into weapons, with more and more ninja learning to harness chakra as the sage once had. Of course, all paled in comparison to what he had been, but that never stopped your pitiful kind from trying. The fox let out a low rumbling sigh as he dropped his head back onto his paws, its eyes losing focus slightly as it remembered the times back then. Then, as ninja always inevitably do, your kind tried to reach beyond the grasp. Tales of the sage faded into legend and myth, and the origin of my own kind was lost to the devilish tongue of man. You kind sought mine out, looking to kill us and be proclaimed heroes for vanquishing us like the demons you saw us as. You could not comprehend our power, so naturally you either tried to take it from us, or extinguish what you could not understand. The fox sighed loudly, suddenly sounding more like a weary old man than an impossibly powerful construct of chakra. I was forced to watch as one by one the rest of the Beiyu were enslaved or captured, forced into vessels of human flesh and bone. However, I was unconcerned. My power was much greater than theirs, my tails greater in number. My pride was my downfall. I believed myself to be the greatest being in existence since the sage himself. The Kyuubi's furred fist slammed down suddenly with rage in its eyes as it glared at Naruto, or more specifically the race he represented. And I still am. It took a deep rumbling breath before settling back down on its stomach, the fire still burning in its eyes. However, even the mighty fall when they underestimate their opponent. I was foolish enough to believe that the single ninja that dared challenge me was just like the rest of your kind, destined to be crushed beneath my tails. However, Madara Uchiha. Again it spit the word out like it didn't even deserve to taint its tongue. Possessed something the rest did not, the Sharingan. The great fox growled lowly as Naruto remembered his time in Konoha, those people with the red eyes who would glare at him just like the rest of the village. An aberration of the sage's dojutsu that he used to enslave me in the most humiliating manner. That cursed man forced me to fight his battles like some common pet. By now the Kyuubi's eyes were alight with rage, its tail swaying ominously. However, he too overstepped his bounds, fighting a man greater than himself, your Shodime Hokage. Like with Madara, the Kyuubi didn't seem to like the taste of that all too much, however he spoke with slightly less spite. Then, like the rest of my kind before me, I was imprisoned, chained down in a vessel of blood and ink. That lasted for a few more decades, and when I finally smelled my freedom in the form of my jailer's death, it was ripped from me. I was traded to a new host, passed down like some piece of jewelry you ninjas find so fascinating. I did not believe it was possible, but the next decade proved to be even worse than before. The fox rubbed its paw lightly as if remembering some phantom injury. I was chained in the dark, impaled all over my body with those accursed chains, unable to even move. When I finally tasted freedom, I only awoke to find myself sealed inside of you, some frail pathetic child that couldn't even stand under its own power. It glared at Naruto for a moment, but the blonde didn't even blink. Then I discovered that this jail was different. I could catch fleeting glimpses of the outside world. The creature snarled for a moment, looking away into the darkness of its cell. You say I attacked your village? The Kyuubi snorted loudly in both disgust and sickening amusement before returning its steady gaze to the blonde. I don't remember it, but I assure you I would have taken the utmost satisfaction in destroying your wretched village for my humiliating imprisonment. There was a long silence before Naruto realized the Kyuubi was finished. It just lay there with its head on its paws, staring at the young monk intently. Naruto stood up from where he had been sitting cross-legged, making the Kyuubi raise its brow slightly in curiosity. The blonde simply walked forward, leaving his shakuju behind on the ground as he walked right up to the bars of the Kyuubi's cage. He didn't stop there though. In a move that surprised the great fox, the young monk slipped through the bars and continued walking forward, all the way until he was right in front of the fox's enormous muzzle, never once breaking eye contact. Finally he stopped, smiling lightly at the fox, which only looked back with steeled and wary features. I am Naruto Uzumaki, monk of the Fire Temple in Hai no Kuni. I cannot speak for the entirety of my race, nor can I profess that they would even support me if I did. However, I would like to offer my most sincere apology for you and your kind's treatment. And with that the young blonde bowed, his head touching the floor in a fully submissive pose before the great Bayu. The fox thought about how easy it would be to simply crush the human. A flick of its paw, a sweep of its tail, it would be no harder than swatting a fly. Of course he would have to wait a year or two for his body to reform and a decade more for his full strength to return, but the possibility was certainly there. This young boy, barely out of his childhood, was bowed before him, not as a servant or in any form of fear, but as an offer of trust. The great fox would deny it if ever asked again, but at that exact moment its maw slipped into the smallest of smiles before immediately returning to its neutral grimace. The Kyuubi merely snorted once, the winds nearly bowling the young blonde over. Stop bowing, ninja. One who bears the sage's eyes should not debase themselves like that. Naruto immediately stood up, the small but genuine smile still present at not being crushed where he stood. It was a gamble he had taken, but he was glad it had paid off. He felt as though this was a real turning point in his relationship with his tenant. The fox was stoic as ever, lifting its head up high over the much smaller human to look down with rather apathetic red eyes. Do not mistake my intentions, ninja. We are not friends, nor are we comrades. I do not like you, nor has my opinion been changed on your worthless race. The great fox inhaled deeply before looking away like a nobleman might when forced to apologize about something. They would do it, but that certainly didn't mean they would like it. However, I will admit you are somewhat different than the rest of your kind. Now leave my cell before I change my mind and crush you like a speck of dust." Naruto just nodded, still maintaining that smile as he quickly slipped back between the bars. The blonde returned to his sitting position by his shakuju, amusedly drumming his fingers along the wooden staff. So different in a good or bad way. By now the fox had returned to lying on its stomach, not even bothering to face the small blonde anymore. Naruto just figured it was acting more aloof than usual to compensate for its momentary lapse of not being the pinnacle of destruction and rage. It turned its head so that one narrowed red eye calmly gazed at the young monk. "We shall see, Ninjan." Naruto sighed a little. He had hoped the Kyuubi would at least call him by his name now, but it seemed the great fox was still just as stubborn as ever. "Any chance of me learning your name then?" The fox snorted loudly, however for once it wasn't in abject disdain or indignation, it was more of a neutral snort. Naruto blinked for a moment at how ridiculous that sounded even in his own head, but when the Kyuubi's main go-to response was a snort or a growl, he had to start discerning meanings in them. "Do not push your already frail luck, Ninjan. Now be gone, this has grown tiresome." Naruto just gave a curt nod with the same small smile before fading from the seal, taking Shukaku's cage with him to leave the Kyuubi in darkened solitude. It slunk back into its lonely cell, curling up around itself on the floor, closer to the gate than it usually did. "He is an unusual one. It seems he has inherited more than simply your eyes, father." The next week for the trio was fairly peaceful. Naruto noticed they were still watched by the Anbu, but he didn't mind that too much. They weren't actually doing anything wrong after all. However, what the Special Ops members didn't know was that they were mostly following hanged shadow clones around all day. It had worked in Suna, so Naruto saw no reason why it wouldn't work in Kumo. It turned out he was right. During the day he would divide his time between helping out Shizuku where he could with her elemental training, trying to master his own lightning exercise, and sparring with Fu. In the evening he would send a shadow clone to help out at various shinobi supply stores, cleaning up for what money the shopkeepers could offer him. It wasn't a great amount, but it was at least enough to tide them over on their journeys. Right now they didn't have to buy much, although Naruto sometimes felt guilty for playing on the old monk's hospitality. Currently he was sitting in that same plateau that had become somewhat of a favorite training ground of his in the short time he had been in Kumo. Omoi had come by a few more times as well. They would talk, he would exaggerate, and the young shinobi would talk to him about his village, his teammates and the like. Nothing classified or that could be considered dangerous, just generic banter more for the sake of conversation more than anything else. The two had become quick friends. Naruto missed having a guy friend to talk to, being surrounded by two girls all day every day. Fu was nearby, practicing a familiar hand seal as increasingly healthy, but still frail clones appeared next to her, only to be banished away in clouds of smoke. Naruto had figured with a Jinchuriki's stamina and reserves the shadow clone technique would suit Fu well. There was also the fact she was not limited with how many she could produce like Naruto was, meaning if she was careful with the mental feedback she could use them for training. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Another large puff echoed around the plateau as a slightly pale and shaky Fu appeared next to the original. Naruto smiled at her accomplishment. She had finally made one that could stand. She was definitely getting closer. She had been working at it for the last 2 hours. Of course Naruto had gotten it down in one, but he had the benefit of having Sora challenge him to see who could master it first. Naturally he had come away the victor from that little challenge. He had the advantage of being the full Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi, not just its chakra. He just continued on with his lighting manipulation. By now he could separate his hands by about 1.5 feet with a few healthy arcs of lightning bouncing between his palms. He might have been imagining things, but he could have sworn each element was becoming easier to master as they went along. Perhaps he was just getting used to separating his chakra into the individual elements, or maybe with each element he mastered it was simpler to separate the remaining ones out of his normal chakra. After a while Fu walked over, looking rather haggard from the intense chakra usage, with a victorious smirk on her features as she sank to the ground beside him. "That is truly an impressive technique. I can't imagine how fast one could learn something using their memory feedback." Naruto just nodded as another bright arc of electricity jumped between his hands like a little azure laser. "Yeah, but you have to be careful. Sora got really bad headaches when he let too many clones dispel at once." The blonde chuckled at the memory. His friend had practically been comatose the next day, but at least he had learned a valuable lesson about restraint. Fu just nodded in understanding, falling onto her back from the exhaustion. Even as a Jinchuriki, splitting her chakra so many times between clones was tiring. She was sure she would be feeling the strain she had put on her pathways in the morning, advanced healing or not. I'm surprised more people don't attempt the training method. The possible gains seem to outweigh the dangers. Naruto let his arms drop, wincing a little as a stray bolt of lightning arced out and burned his arm slightly at his loss of control. Maybe for me and you, but from what I've seen, Jinchuriki seem to be a somewhat special case. I don't really know how to describe it, but our chakra seems denser than others. It means we can split it more safely as our bodies can operate with less than others. Normal people can't, so they're limited to maybe 20 clones at the very most. Beyond that, it's just dangerous. There's also the problem of maintaining them long enough to be of any use. The longest I've ever held a clone is about 10 hours. Beyond that, they seem to become unstable. Add that to their frailty and they lose their value as training tools. Fu just nodded understandably. Despite her status as Jinchuriki feeling like a curse most of the time, she could at least accept it gave her certain advantages over others. I understand. From what you described, they seem more suited for reconnaissance. Naruto just nodded. From what Chiriku had told him, that was exactly what they were for. Suddenly the two were interrupted by a scrabbling sound. They turned to see Shizuku descending the mountain towards them rather quickly, an excited look on her face. She skidded to a stop in front of them, panting slightly from running but grinning all the same. Naruto, I found them. The aforementioned blonde just quirked an eyebrow as the girl straightened up, catching her second wind before elaborating. You know, you told us about that sage guy, the one who had the Rinnegan before you. Naruto winced at how loudly she had said it. Luckily the Anbu were off chasing his shadow clones, but Shizuku probably didn't know that. You said he had a lot of objects that he put his power into, like your staff. The blonde wanted to correct the girl that it was a shakuju, not a staff. However, he was too interested in where this was going to stop her. Well, they're here. In Kumo. The blonde just blinked in surprise before asking the obvious, getting to his feet from his cross-legged position in the process. How do you know? Shizuku smiled proudly as she produced a small leaflet from a pouch of hers she kept around her waist. Naruto looked it over quickly. It just seemed to be an ordinary museum pamphlet, advertising the various attractions the place had to offer. There were exhibits on the origins of Kumo, a weapons display from the Warring Clans period, and a special exhibit on the Sage of the Six Paths. He looked up in surprise only to see a grinning Shizuku, almost looking like a dog waiting for its master to pat it on the head. Wow, great find, Shizuku. He moved forward, quickly sweeping the girl into a spinning hug, much to her embarrassment and Fu's unnoticed chagrin. He finally set the blushing girl down to reread the pamphlet, but it didn't have much more information besides the times the museum was open. Did you get a look at anything? Shizuku quickly shook her head, still looking a little red from the unexpected hug. Oh no, I ran right over here when I found out. Naruto just nodded absently as he continued to scour the leaflet. Fu walked across the small plateau, glancing over his shoulder at the piece of paper before staring at his shakuju. Why would Kumo keep something as powerful as the sage's tools in a museum? Why not actually use them? Naruto finally looked up from the pamphlet, a small grin on his face as he shook his shakuju lightly, getting it to jingle. Well, if they're anything like this, then hardly anybody would be able to hold them, never mind use them. Really only a Kage, a Jinchuriki or a Rinnegan user would be able to properly use them. Fu just nodded. She had once held Naruto's staff out of curiosity, and despite her enormous reserves, she was sure even an hour holding that simple wooden staff would drain her dry. It made her appreciate it all the more that Naruto could carry it around all day with no visible drain on his chakra. It was truly made for a Rinnegan user. But Kumo has two Jinchuriki as far as the other countries are aware, the Nibi no Nekomata and the Hachibi no Kyogyu. Naruto just shrugged. He couldn't really say why the village wouldn't utilize such powerful tools. Maybe the tools just don't fit with their fighting styles. Nobody really had an answer for him. They knew just as much as he did on the subject. Perhaps he could get something out of the Kyuubi, but he was being especially sullen and unresponsive lately. It was actually rather amusing to see the great fox acting petulantly. Well, I guess we know where we'll find the answers. The Kumo Museum was a surprisingly small building, Until of course you realized that since it was built into a mountain, most of the exhibits were in the lower levels. It did stick out a little though, being built out of a shining white marble as opposed to the normal grey-hued materials the rest of Kumo was constructed from. You could tell the whole place was built for the express purpose of attracting tourists. There was even a little gift shop selling replica headbands and other Kumogakure memorabilia. Inside it was cool and well ventilated to make up for the sometimes cramped spaces filled with people that would otherwise make it stiflingly hot. The Sage of the Six Paths exhibit was on the lowest accessible level of the museum, everything below it being maintenance or storage. The trio had a surprisingly good time looking through the other displays. Naruto especially enjoyed a display on the Hachibi and its various attacks on the village. There was even a small model of Kumo with a to-scale Hachibi in the middle of destroying it. There it is. The blonde felt a tug on his sleeve and turned to see Shizuku pointing out another hallway with a sign designating it as the Sage's display. They quickly made their way inside, not really finding anything all that different. All the displays were still set into the wall or on tables in the center of the room. Naturally, Naruto gravitated over to the large panoramic window that held the tools themselves. They don't look all that impressive. Naruto found himself agreeing with Fuu's hushed whisper. It was an odd collection of items. The first was possibly the most impractical sword Naruto had ever seen, the label marking it as the Shichisaken. It was a wide metal blade that folded around a thin central metal pole. The information mentioned something about severing, word souls, or something of the like. It didn't make a lot of sense to the young monk. Next along was the kukenju, a long golden rope, supposedly used to bind and draw out one's word soul with some kind of verbal command. Again Naruto was confused by the phrase, wondering just what a word soul was. It seemed there was no actual information on it. Obviously Kumo didn't want people knowing how their treasured tools worked. The blonde just shook his head. Communication was the first step towards understanding. Hoarding knowledge never ended well historically. The item after that was a large crimson gourd that reminded Naruto a little of Gaara's sand container, except it didn't have a Suna headband wrapped around the middle. It was the Beni Hisago and apparently completed the word soul trio, capturing them within itself after they were severed and drawn out. In all they seemed like strange group of items and it looked like you would need all three to get any use out of them. However, due to the bulky gourd and unwieldy sword that seemed highly impractical, it would make more sense for two people working in tandem. The fourth item was different to the rest, an enormous and colorful fan made of unidentifiable bird feathers. The Bashousen. It confused Naruto though, as the description said it allowed the user to generate all 5 chakra natures. That made no sense. Due to the Rinnegan, Naruto was already able to use all 5 elements. Why would the sage need this? The more Naruto thought about it, the more he began to think these tools were not actually for the sage. He wondered if they had been gifts like his own shakuju had been at one point. He feared he might never get an answer though. Finally there was the item in the center of the room, cordoned off by both velvet ropes and a thick layer of glass. It was a huge stone purifying pot with a thick white rope wrapped around the top and a stylized version of the kanji for lightning imprinted on it. Naruto quickly guessed the mark was more recently added. The pot was supposed to be able to seal anything inside, merging it with the liquid inside. In fact, it had been used on 3 separate occasions to capture the Hachibi before it was transferred to a new Jinchuriki. Yeah, the only thing that looks useful is the fan and you can already use all 5 elements. Shizuku suddenly spoke from his left, looking intently at the large stone pot. Naruto just chuckled at his 2 companions looking at each object with curious gazes. Actually, none of these are of any use to me. The 2 girls just looked around, blinking in confusion. I don't understand, they were created by the Sage of the 6 Paths, they have to have at least some use. Naruto just shook his head, motioning with his arms in a sweeping gesture that encompassed the room. No, I mean all of these are fake, there's no chakra in them. Fu and Shizuku just nodded in understanding. If there was anybody who could tell if something belonged to the sage or not, it was Naruto. I see, these must be replicas. The real ones are most likely better protected somewhere else. Naruto just nodded. He had been thinking the same thing as Fu. There was no way Kumo would just leave all the treasured tools out like this, even with the security and barrier seals on all the glass. Naruto simply shrugged as he began to walk for the exit, having lost interest in the fake display. Fu and Shizuku quickly followed him and soon the trio were outside the museum, sitting on a low bench across the street. So how are we supposed to learn anything about the sage if the items on display are all fakes? Not surprisingly, it was Shizuku who posed the innocent question, quickly met by matching smirks from Fu and Naruto. The purple-haired girl just groaned into her hands. She could already imagine what her friends were thinking. Can we please not make another enemy out of a hidden village? Naruto just shrugged while Fu didn't seem to care in the slightest. Then again, she was already being hunted by one hidden village. Are you worried too much, Shizuku? The girl just looked at the blonde with a stern expression which made the boy grin sheepishly. You're planning on stealing the tools, aren't you? It wasn't really a question, so Naruto didn't really feel like answering. He just got up off the bench and started walking back to the temple. Fu quickly followed him while Shizuku just looked at the two with her eye twitching slightly. Naruto. The boy just kept walking, waving back to the Miko-esque girl cheekily. Naruto. She raced after him. She already knew whatever he had planned would be a bad idea. Shizuku was right, it was a bad idea. Thankfully Naruto didn't plan on attempting to steal a practical national treasure of Kumo. At least not yet. For one, they didn't know where said treasures even were, the real ones, and they had no idea what kind of protection they might have. Of course, that only made the blonde monk see it as a kind of challenge, something that only increased Shizuku's fears. She knew that when Naruto had a goal he would move heaven and earth to see it accomplished. That did not bode well for them if Kumo ever found out what they were planning. However, right now everything was returning to normal. Naruto was still practicing his lightning manipulation, having recently gotten the second stage from Omoi. Shizuku was still refining her control over water and Fu was doing whatever it was Fu did. Honestly, the mint-haired girl was a little bit of a mystery to Shizuku. She would wander off into Kumo off half the day only to come back around lunch, spar with Naruto until she was tired, then wander off again. Shizuku had no idea what the girl did or where she went. As far she could tell, Fu just liked her peace and quiet. The Violette figured it was her own way of proving her independence after having her every move controlled by Taki. Unfortunately, right now Fu seemed rather aimless. She lacked a goal other than to follow Naruto and protect him. It was obvious though she was looking for something, trying to find a purpose in her life where she previously had none of her own. Shizuku's inner monologue was cut short as Naruto strode into the temple, a large grin on his face as he walked forward, picked Shizuku up into a brief hug and span her around before walking on into another room. The girl had to shake off her sudden goofy trance at the intimate hug before quickly following Naruto into the other room where he was muttering to himself quietly but energetically, almost like he was having a conversation with himself. Naruto. As much as I enjoyed the hug, can you tell me why? The blonde just looked around with the same victorious grin. For a moment Shizuku feared, and somewhat didn't mind, that he might pull her into another embrace. I've got it, I know how we can get the tools. Shizuku blinked. She might have been against attempting to steal priceless relics from a very powerful hidden village, but she couldn't help but be interested. It didn't help that Naruto had naturally infectious good moods and she was getting swept away in his glowing grin. Really? How? If anything, his smile stretched even wider, his steely purple eyes almost glowing with chakra. I'm going to learn how to turn invisible. Ag. This is impossible. Naruto sat dejectedly in his favorite training ground, his hands clasped in the ram seal which was supposed to aid the drawing out and subconscious molding of chakra. Fu sat to one side, calmly reading through a scroll on the basic fundamentals of chakra. Naruto had found she was the type who always reverted to studying the basics when she was stuck on what to do. Without any access to jutsu scrolls or taijutsu techniques and without Naruto being willing to spar, she didn't have much else to do. Then are you going to look for another way? Naruto just shot Fu a pointed look that clearly said he wasn't. Of course not, I'm going to find a way to turn invisible if it's the last thing I do. Fu just tilted her head in that same cutely innocent way that just spoke of how little she had been taught when she was younger. But didn't you just say it was impossible? Naruto sighed slightly, leaning back on his hands and catching himself before he ran a hand through his hair. That was becoming somewhat of a habit lately. It's just the frustration talking. I know it's possible, that old pervert back in Kuni could do it. That's part of where I got the idea from in the first place. Fu quirked an eyebrow but didn't say anything else, preferring to return to her scroll. She took solace in her reading. In fact, most days they spent in Kumo now she would devote at least a few hours in the public library. To her it didn't particularly matter what she read, as long as it allowed her to escape her world and memories for just a few hours. She had particularly taken to fantasy novels, enjoying the action and otherworldly adventure the protagonists got up to. In a way she could sometimes relate her own life to some of the stories. The lonely maiden in a desolate and unfair life, whisked away by the cavalier prince on a mystical adventure. Of course she didn't quite understand many of the aspects in these stories, the romance in particular both confounded and intrigued her. She didn't understand why people skirted around issues such as love or attraction. Then again, having never particularly felt those emotions, at least to her knowledge, she found she couldn't relate all that well. She had a lot of time to read lately, what with Naruto taking upon himself the crusade of becoming invisible. It was something he had been trying and finding only partial success in for the past 2 weeks. It was sometimes both amusing and incredible what the boy would come up with in attempt to servant vision. More so as his ideas become more and more ludicrous with each passing, and failing, attempt. His first answer had obviously been genjutsu. Unfortunately there already existed many countermeasures to such methods. He had the chakra control for it, as well as the imagination, however he just simply wasn't skilled enough to fool anybody above Chunin level. It wasn't a fault of his own, but the skill took a lot of time and dedication to master, time he didn't really have and couldn't replicate with shadow clones fast enough. His next attempt had been slightly more basic, an adapted version of the henge that could literally change as he moved. It worked to an extent. He simply hanged every part of his body into an image of what was behind him. Surprisingly, the problem did not lie in the chakra control, although it was extraordinarily high. It was the fact he could just simply not think quickly enough to compensate for the changing image. Therefore there was slight lag in the technique. It wasn't noticeable if he was moving slowly, but it would give him away at even a normal walk. Fu had been interested in it, however, even though she lacked the immense control required to use it, likening it to how a chameleon worked. That was when the blonde's next bout of inspiration hit, quickly summoning a chameleon to study, only to be surprised to find they too had a summoning contract. Interestingly though, their boss summon had not been seen in quite some time and their last summoner had died, meaning the contract scroll itself was lost to them. Most had long since believed they would never be summoned again, prompting them to be quite accepting of the young monk. He had studied with one of their kind for a while, a large chameleon by the name of Shiroshaku that was about the size of a large dog. Unfortunately the lizard had no real idea how their own pseudo-invisibility worked. It was more of an instinctual power like Naruto's Rinnegan abilities. However, even though they became completely invisible and their chakra signature vanished, they still had a weak scent, which mean they weren't completely undetectable if someone worked at trying to find them. Near the end of that particular venture, Shiroshaku had suggested Naruto could just summon a larger chameleon and hide inside of it. Needless to say, Naruto quickly but politely turned that proposition down, saving it for a last resort. Even though it turned out to be a dead end, Naruto had made rather good friends with the chameleons, promising that if he ever discovered their leader, Shiromari, he would do what he could to send him back home. Next, Naruto had turned to space-time ninjutsu. That was quickly abandoned as well. He had quickly discovered that the sheer skill, time, and patience that went into creating such a complex and powerful technique was just staggering. His original intention was to create a technique that was able to somehow teleport the light hitting him to the other side of his body, effectively rendering him invisible to normal light. However, while that was a dead end, or at least such a long end that it might as well be dead, it did give him other ideas. Instead of subverting the light like he had planned, he began to toy with the idea of bending light around his body. There were certain impracticalities associated with it though, highest on the list being that it would render him completely blind for the duration of the technique. Naturally, no light hitting his body also meant no light hitting his eyes, meaning he wouldn't be able to see. He didn't expect a floating set of eyes would be all that discreet, however he stuck with the idea for a while. He found there were actually a few ways to bend light, such as the fact it was subject to gravity like anything else in the universe. However, the extra forces of gravity required to bend light to any useful degree would probably start rending the planet before he could get any use out of it. He put that in the Plan B column. He also knew you could refract light through certain mediums. That in particular interested him. For the first time in probably too long, Naruto began to think about the properties of chakra again. He supposed that it was a substance of sorts. It could be visible in high enough concentrations like a gas, it could flow and move like water, it could even be corrosive and poisonous at the extreme end of the spectrum. He began to experiment with it, manipulating his chakra into a thin covering around his hands, trying to find the exact point when it became visible. He had almost shouted out in victory as he noticed a slight distortion around his hand. The chakra was actually refracting the light to a certain degree. Now it was just a matter of finding a point at which he could cloak his entire body in it, all at the correct angles that he would probably have to be adjusting on the fly as he moved, and therein lay his problem. He had certainly found a method of turning invisible, without the noticeable drawback of the others, but for once it was actually his control letting him down. That was why he was currently on the verge of ripping his hair out in his training ground, his arms semi-translucent and rippling like water as he manipulated the chakra, covering it like a shroud. At least one good thing about this technique was that it didn't actually waste any chakra. When he was finished, he could simply reabsorb the thin layer around his body. It meant he could train literally as long as he was awake, which he had been doing for the past 5 days. Right now he was actually thinking of ways he could extend how long he could stay awake. Mostly to avoid having to think about the impossibly difficult task he had set himself. He sighed again in abject frustration as he lost control, more of his forearm returning to the visible spectrum. So far only his fingertips could stay completely invisible. It was actually rather unnerving as it looked like they had been chopped off. Right now though, Naruto was just trying to extend the technique over his entire body, as opposed to just one arm. It hadn't all just been one frustration after another though. Naruto had interestingly found out that at the perfect angle chakra didn't just refract light. He couldn't explain the physics behind it, nor probably would he ever. But it seemed chakra was a rather unique medium. Just like it technically lacked form until molded or gathered in high enough quantities, it also lacked any kind of smell. That meant that when using the technique, if he could ever get it to work properly, he wouldn't just be rendered invisible, but nigh undetectable. Only sound or touch would give him away, and Naruto could already use chakra to muffle his movements to a certain degree. Fu looked up from her scroll as Naruto groaned in frustration yet again. She couldn't decide whether or not his determination in the face of such odds was amusing or admirable. She would never have the control to even attempt what the young monk was trying to do, never mind come up with the concept or a reasonable method to achieve it. Watching Naruto go through idea after idea without once even thinking of giving up had been somewhat of an eye-opener for her. She wanted that, she wanted a goal to believe in so much she would do anything to get it. Perhaps you just need to rest, give yourself some time to relax and think things through. The vedette was actually rather surprised she had spoken, having preferred to stay quiet most of the time and simply observe the blonde as he practiced. However, he just looked so wound up and agitated that she couldn't help but intervene. She had seen it many times with shinobi on teams she had been assigned to. Frustration only led to a lack in concentration, and that led to mistakes. I can't stop now. I know I'm close to a breakthrough. He spoke with such passion that it brought a small smile to the mint-haired Jinchuriki's face. She tucked her scroll away, having already read it more than a few times through, and walked over to him, laying a soft hand on his shoulder. If you remain stressed, you will only continue to frustrate yourself. After training one's muscles, you must give them time to recuperate. The mind and the chakra system are no different. Naruto was about to argue with the girl, but there was something about the way she spoke that made him falter. She didn't speak with condescension or like she knew what was best for him, she only recommended as a friend with his best interests in heart. He sighed at her soft, steady voice and nodded with a small smile, getting to his feet and stretching out his stiff back with a satisfying click. Maybe you're right, I think I'll go for a walk. Omoi told me there are some impressive sights just outside of the village, and with all this training I never really got around to checking them out. He grinned at the caramel-skinned girl, eliciting a warm feeling in her stomach she couldn't explain. It made her wonder if she was ill or something. She just nodded with a small smile and began to walk back to the temple. The only reason she was out here was to watch Naruto's progress. She much preferred to read somewhere quiet and homely. Naruto found himself wandering rather aimlessly. His thoughts were still transfixed on the problem that had been eluding him for the past week. He knew he was supposed to be relaxing for the express purpose of losing those thoughts, at least for a little while, but ingrained habits don't break that easily. However, as engrossed in his thoughts as he was still able to cast an appreciative eye about his surroundings. It was one of the many places Omoi had recommended to him in their conversations, among various onsen, a large hanging garden, one of the oldest shrines in the elemental nations, and the enormous stadium where Kumo hosted their Chunin exams. It was built out of the hollowed-out crater of a large dormant volcano. However, Naruto had decided first to visit what had been affectionately dubbed the Stone Garden. It was a network of enormous stone pillars that rose up out of an even larger lake, surrounded on all four sides by some of the largest mountains in Kaminari no Kuni. Some were pointed at the top while others were flat or even blossomed out like rocky mushrooms. It really was an impressive place to just wander through, especially considering Naruto had the luxury of simply walking across the water's surface. It gave him a unique perspective to look up at the towering pillars and spikes of stone. He continued to wander and think, drawing a random path through the almost labyrinthine network of pillars until he found himself near the center of the construct. He met a strange sight there, what looked to be possibly the remains of one of the stone pillars, a perfectly circular slab of rock just above the water level. Behind it a set of ornate stone steps with bright golden barriers flanking them as they climbed the mountain behind it to a small temple. Curious, Naruto climbed the stairs, feeling the lingering chakra of whoever had been training here. They were obviously very powerful to leave such dense chakra hanging in the air for any amount of time. He stopped at the top, admiring the simple but well-maintained building with two canvas flaps flanking the doorway. Almost as soon as his foot touched the last step, a man emerged from the building. Yo, it seems the mighty Killer Bee's got somebody up and visiting me. Naruto raised an eyebrow at the very strange and obviously rather eccentric man before him. He had the traditional dark skin that most Kumo residents possessed, as well as a large muscular build that offset his otherwise goofy appearance. He wore sunglasses with an almost all-white outfit including a flak jacket, scarf, headband, shin guards, and fingerless gloves. Other than that, he wore dark blue pants and had the kanji for iron tattooed on his exposed shoulder. Hello, I didn't realize anybody was actually here, I thought the temple was empty. It was a small lie, but he didn't need this man knowing he could sense the lingering chakra in the air. Standing in front of him, though, Naruto realized why rather quickly, he was a Jinchuriki, there was no disguising it, or at least the man lacked the control to disguise it. Bayu chakra was radiating from him in waves, he had obviously been practicing with it recently. Man, you must be a real out-of-towner, now ain't that a downer, cause everybody would agree this is the home of the mighty Killer Bee. As the man talked, he would occasionally move his head or arms to a beat only he seemed to be able to hear. It was actually rather amusing. It's nice to meet you, Kiribi. Naruto inclined his head slightly. It would do good to make a nice first impression on his fellow Jinchuriki. Surprisingly, though, the large man placed a hand on his shoulders with a beaming grin on his bearded features. Now, little monk, get out of that funk, cause there's no need for the pleasantry between us fellow Jinchuriki, ya fool. He bobbed his head to the silent beat again, making Naruto smirk before grinning sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his neck. Huh, really that obvious? The large man just nodded with his own smirk, eyes sparkling with amusement behind his dark shades. Oh yeah, mighty Hachibi-sama's brewing up some real drama when he felt the host of Mr. 9 approach our little shrine. Naruto raised a surprised eyebrow at that. He didn't realize he could not only detect he was a Jinchuriki, but for which Bayu. He was just glad the Kyuubi's presence seemed to override Shukaku's. That might have thrown up some awkward questions he wasn't sure how to answer. He wondered if the Kyuubi could sense his fellow Bayu in the same way. So you can talk to the Hachibi. Kiribi just nodded as he began to walk inside the temple, Naruto quickly following him. Inside it was surprisingly spacious, the entire room hollowed out of the mountain's stone. The blonde had a feeling Kiribi had not built this place himself. There were many murals on the wall, some of the Hachibi and a few of what he could only assume was the Nibi. Yeah, me and Hachibi-sama have faced all kinds of trauma, we're partners you see, making me the perfect Jinchuriki, ya fool. Naruto ignored the last part as he thought about what he meant by a perfect Jinchuriki and if he could attain that. So you and the Hachibi have a good relationship. Kiribi nodded again in his strange manner with his arms crossed and his body leant back slightly. At first me and the Hachibi were all fighting and was my enemy, but we got ta some serious rappin' and I found out he didn't like I was trappin', we. Naruto just nodded, The Kyuubi had told him many times of his dislike of being caged inside a worthless ninja. So we worked out a deal, Hachibi-sama and me, and the rest is history, 'cause we're the mighty Eight Tails and Killer Bee. Ya fool. The large man just stood there for a moment, as if basking in the cheers of some invisible crowd, which the blonde actually found rather unnerving. So Mr. Nine, you be looking mighty fine, why'd you come find the Killer Bee when last I heard you were in the big tree? Naruto could only assume Kiribi meant Konoha by that. With his strange manner of talking he could only guess these things. He suddenly had an epiphany that this must be the Bee Sensei Omoi talked about, small world. Actually I had no idea you were here. A friend told me this place was a good spot to visit and I was frustrated about something, so I came out here to relax. Kiribi just nodded again in that same eccentric manner as the two sat down on the floor, both in cross-legged positions. Naruto could tell from his ease at the position that the large Jinchuriki was no stranger to meditation, at least if his posture was anything to go by. It may have also had something to do with finding a comfortable position to sit in with 7 swords strapped to his back. Ain't no place fresher to clear your head and no place better to get ma rhymes read, we. Naruto just nodded. He had noticed as he walked that the air just felt cleaner around here. It was like his mind had been in a haze before and it had only just begun to clear. He felt refreshed and rejuvenated after all the tension of the last week's training. The blonde looked up, unsure of how to broach his next topic. Honestly, he hadn't expected to run into one of the Jinchuriki of the village so soon. So, how is it in Kumo? It was an innocent question, but he got a feeling Kiribi understood what the young monk was trying to say. In essence, he was asking if the older Jinchuriki had been mistreated. As far as the blonde could tell, having to come so far out of the village for peace wasn't a good sign. Well, ain't that cute? Little Nine be worried about the Killer Bee. Well, you don't have to, because nobody would be hurtin' on me. Ya fool. Naruto just nodded with a pleasant smile. It was good to meet at least one Jinchuriki who wasn't hated by their village. His previous conceptions about Kumo before coming hadn't been all that good, tainted by Konoha propaganda. There were the last wars, the Hyuga incident, and a few others that put them in a bad light in Konoha. However, after living there he realized it was just like everywhere else, with people just trying to get by in life. I'm glad. B nodded in his half-sagely, half-rap way, looking off at some invisible crowd even though Naruto knew his eyes were firmly on the blonde beneath his shades. Yo little monk, you look a little down, you saying it was the leaf that made you frown? Naruto just smiled wanly as he leaned back on his hands. He hadn't had any contact with Konoha in over 5 years. With a start he realized it had really been that long since he had run away from his former home. No, I have a good life, strong bonds with my friends, and a stubborn but at least knowledgeable fox in my guts. Anyway, I've mostly been on the road for the past year. The leaf hasn't had anything to do with my frowns for a long time. He chuckled at that but kept it as vague as he could. He wanted to trust his fellow Jinchuriki, but this wasn't Fu. Kiribi did not hate his village and was in turn not hated. He had to remember that. While he did not agree with the whole balance of power the Bayou represented, he at least acknowledged this and didn't want to start a war between Kumo and Konoha. That's tight, yo. A good friend on your back that can help take the flak is all you need, we. Naruto just nodded with a small smile before standing up, Kiribi copying the action. I know this is asking a lot, but is there any way the Raikage won't find out about me being here? I don't want to cause a war or anything. Kiribi just smirked as he moved forward, arms still crossed over his chest. NA man, we cool, anything else would just be cruel. Gotta stay tight with my fellow Jinchuriki or my name ain't the mighty Killer Bee. You don't gotta worry about ma bro finding out, it's like you were never here without a doubt. He finished by moving his hand across his mouth in a zipping motion before holding his hand out, fist clenched with the knuckles facing Naruto. The blonde just gave a smile of his own before bumping fists with the eccentric, but at least friendly Kumo shinobi. It was really good meeting you, Kiribi. It's nice to see a Jinchuriki having a good life. Kiribi just nodded, sporting a similar smile as opposed to his usual grin. The two stayed and talked a little while longer, sometimes about training, sometimes about Kiribi's rapping. Naruto even mentioned Fu to him, and the older Jinchuriki expressed that he would like to meet another of their small group. Naruto had parted with the dark-skinned shinobi, promising to bring Fu around sometime. He honestly thought the girl needed more people to talk to besides him and Shizuku. Naruto left the stone garden feeling oddly lighter, refreshed and relaxed in comparison to how he felt earlier. He had a small but genuine smile on his face as he wandered back to the temple. It seemed a bit of rest was exactly what Naruto needed. In the next week he made astounding progress in his technique. He could now effectively cover his entire body in a thin layer of refractive chakra. Now all he needed to do was work on refining it to reduce his visibility entirely. However, as it was he was undetectable by most means, his chakra signature vanished, he couldn't be smelled, and when he applied a soft layer of chakra to his feet he couldn't be heard by probably anyone less than an Inuzuka. All in all he was rather satisfied with his self-created technique. For the first time he felt like he was doing something for himself as opposed to just following in somebody else's footprints. It was liberating and Naruto wanted to continue the feeling. He figured it would only get better once he had completed the technique. He had a lot of fun sneaking up on his companions and startling them, which continued to irk Fu. Surprisingly, he seemed to have sparked something in her after one of his little pranks, and she had resolved to find a way of counteracting Naruto's invisibility. The blonde was actually rather glad. She had been a little aimless recently and now she had a fire behind her eyes and purpose in her step. It was relieving to see Fu finally doing something other than just sit around and read or spar, although she didn't stop doing those either. He just hoped the vedette didn't take it too far. As he wandered through the shopping district earlier he had heard a few people talking about a sudden insect problem. They didn't need attention drawn to them when they were about to commit a crime against the village. However, it did spark Naruto's own curiosity about how the girl might go about finding somebody who couldn't be seen, smelt or heard. He had also kept his promise and taken Fu to meet Kiribi. He couldn't say the two were instant friends, but they seemed to have an understanding. Kiribi knew never to stray too close to her past, and in turn Fu never commented on her annoyance with the way the older Jinchuriki talked. Kiribi had offered them both a few pointers on controlling their Beiyu chakra, however they had both declined. Naruto felt uncomfortable taking the Kyuubi's chakra when he was finally starting to see some change in the fox. He wanted to build a better foundation in the relationship between them before he went after anything like that. That was if he even needed it. The Sage of the Six Paths defeated the Juubi under his own power. Naruto had his goal already in mind. Fu on the other hand already had experience with her inner power. She just didn't want anything to do with it anymore. Taki had controlled her and the creature inside of her for too long. She would become strong under her own power, not on what she borrowed from somebody, or something else. Other than that, the last week had gone rather well. They all seemed in high spirits, although Naruto would emphasize, seemed. He had noticed something was up with Shizuku lately, which was why he was currently up on the roof of the temple with her, lying back on the ceramic tiles and staring up at the sky. They had both sat in relative silence for the last 5 minutes, just content to allow their eyes to roam between the various pinpricks of light. How many do you think there are? Stars, I mean. It had been so quiet that Naruto was nearly startled when Shizuku suddenly spoke up, her soft melancholic tone affirming his suspicions she was not as happy as she appeared. He didn't turn, just kept his eyes up at the darkened sky, mostly focused on the intense white disk hanging up there. I don't know, but I bet people have tried to count them. Shizuku absently nodded, her eyes not straying from the sky either. I still can't believe how beautiful it looks. Naruto smiled softly. Shizuku really hadn't been happier than their time in Kumo. Being able to see the sky as opposed to dreary rain clouds was still just amazing to her now, as it was the first day. You know, sometimes I still think that, even after all these years. It was true, there was just something peaceful about the sky, to look up at it and know that everybody else in the world saw the exact same stars, the same moon, the greatest equalizer. Do you think I'll always have this curse? Naruto sighed, suddenly realizing why Shizuku seemed so sad recently behind her happy demeanor. She was worried about leaving Kumo, returning to her place under the clouds where it could rain on her again. She didn't want the sky to be taken away from her now that she had a taste. No. Shizuku sat up and looked around, a little surprised at the firmness in Naruto's tone. It was so definite, so certain. The blonde also sat up, turning to Shizuku with a small but confident smile. What makes you so certain? Her voice was quiet, unsure, contrasting greatly with Naruto's more secure tone. The blonde just smiled as he got up and moved closer. The girl, sitting back down with an exaggerated sigh. Remember the promise I made to you. He turned with the most brilliant and genuine smile Shizuku had ever seen on his face. I never go back on my promises. One day you will be able to look up at the sky whenever you want and see the stars, or the sun. He turned back to the sky, the smile settling down but not losing any of its previous energy. Hell, if I have to, I'll just take you to K's no Kuni. Even if it rains, you'll just be doing the residents a favor. They both chuckled at that, Shizuku finally gaining some confidence in herself, but more importantly, in Naruto. Thanks, Naruto. The blonde just waved her off sheepishly, his smile becoming slightly more embarrassed. He still didn't do well with positive interaction with people. It's no problem, you're my friend. He was surprised when Shizuku grabbed his head, tuning it so she could look him in the eye. She hesitated for a moment as his faintly glowing purple orbs locked gazes with her own before shaking her head quickly and smiling. No, really, without you I would still be in that bandit camp, or sold off to some slavers. Quote. She shuddered a little as her features once again became melancholic. Quote. Or worse. Naruto just lay a comforting hand on her shoulder which instantly brought her back around. But you saved me and showed me things I never believed I would ever get to see. Her smile became a grin as she made a sweeping gesture to the sky. Case in point. They both chuckled again before Shizuku brought Naruto's head back around to face her. So thank you, Naruto. With that she leant forward and planted a small chaste K on his lips. When they parted, both their faces had a tint of red in them and Shizuku was smiling lightly. Naruto was a little dazed by the contact which made the Violette giggle as she got to her feet carefully and climbed down. Naruto spent another 10 minutes up on the roof just thinking about things, not even noticing the absent smile playing across his lips. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.